Excellent. All right, let's get on the record. Ms. Rivers, are you ready? This is, as it always is with this case, 2022 EX 000024. It concerns the special purpose grand jury, and we're gathered today, the 9th of August, to discuss the appearance of Mr. Giuliani. He was scheduled to be here today to appear before the grand jury. I, yesterday, upon receiving a motion from Mr. Thomas, and I'll have folks make their appearances in just a moment, seeking to have his client appear on a different day, excuse Mr. Giuliani from today for reasons that we'll be getting on the record in a minute. It seems to me like communications haven't flowed real smoothly between the district attorney's office and Mr. Giuliani's two lawyers. There's a lawyer up in New York as well. But be that as it may, it was too late in the game to say, no, I'm not going to grant the motion to continue, I think from practicality and prudential reasons. And so I let Mr. Thomas and Mr. Wade know that Mr. Giuliani would be excused from not being here today. But the purpose of today's hearing is to sort out when he will be here and in what format. And I'm going to let the two sides air that out more completely right now. But Mr. Thomas has made clear that Mr. Giuliani is not seeking to not appear, but it's a question of when he could be down here, or if he's not here physically, if there are other ways in which he could appear before the grand jury. The district attorney's office can consider those, doesn't need to accept anything short of in-person appearance, but I wanted us to have an opportunity to discuss and to clear up some of the concerns that the district attorney's office raised, that maybe some of the reasons that Mr. Giuliani offered through his lawyers weren't what they seem to be. I need clarity. If it turns out that Mr. Giuliani is willfully disregarding the now formal invitation to be here, that's problematic. If that's not the situation, then we need to establish the when that he'll be here. And there are lots of ways to make that happen. And rather than having emails bouncing back and forth and the two sides saying the other side's not listening, I can guarantee that at least everyone is hearing what's being said, and we'll go from there. So I think what I'll do, Mr. Thomas, is start with you because you filed, bless you, the original motion to continue. You can get into the record what you want. And then Mr. Wade, I will hear from you or anyone on your team, the state's perspective, and then we'll figure out what we're going to do to ensure that Mr. Giuliani honors the directive, not only from this court, but from a companion court in New York, that he appear before the special purpose grand jury. Mr. Thomas?
Thank you. You want us at the podium?
So as long as you're at a microphone, then Ms. Rivers can hear you, but she may say, no, Judge, have him at the podium. Do you have a preference? All right. Be audible. And the light should be green on your microphone. If it's not green, tap the little indentation. Yep, that's definitely working.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, I believe you have appropriately characterized where we are. Again, I will just reiterate, I had hoped to, and always in my experience, on whichever side of the V I've sat on, it has always been my practice to work out what we can work out. And obviously, if things get to a point where you can't work it out, then we have to appear in court. Obviously, for whatever reasons, that hasn't happened here. We are just seeking some, I think where we are today is we're seeking a continuance until Mr. Giuliani is cleared to travel. Obviously, we have put forth and set forth a number of alternatives that I believe would satisfy the district attorney's office. Obviously, they'll speak for themselves shortly about why those options are not reasonable alternatives. For the record, we are happy to appear via Zoom if that can be worked out under conditions that would replicate a grand jury proceeding here in Atlanta, Georgia. We are happy to consent to a voluntary interview of Mr. Giuliani, be that via Zoom, or if we want to travel to New York to do that, or wherever he is located now. If there are other reasonable alternatives, we will consider those. I think that where we are, judges, this is not a situation of not making the witness available. It is how he's going to be available. We have provided a medical excuse to the court, to the district attorney's office. In those letters, or at least in one of those letters, we have invited the district attorney's office to contact Mr. Giuliani's healthcare provider, his doctor, who is, I believe, a doctor at Sinai in New York. That wasn't sufficient. Where we are today is, again, we're asking the court if some reasonable alternative can't be made to allow them to get the information that they want, I think we're just forced to ask this court to exercise its authority and continue the matter. I know the $1 million question is, I'll get to that, is when he'll be available. What I can tell you is ideally, we think reasonably available in mid-September, but I don't know the answer to that. I know he is scheduled for a follow-up, I believe in late August. That's what I can tell the court with regards to that. I want to just address a couple of issues, a couple of things that were raised in the district attorney's most recent filing. First,
so I'm going to pause you on that. You've filed a response that'll be of record if it's not already, so folks can consume that as they see fit. If the district attorney's office wants to explore some of the things they set forth in their filing, by all means, you can say they weren't paid for in cash, the things you put in your motion. I want to stay as focused as we can on the limited time we have, because I'm calling a trial calendar at 1:30 on when we can get Mr. Giuliani before the grand jury.
Sure.
So a couple observations from me, and then Mr. Wade and his colleagues can take over. To date, I don't think there has been a virtual appearance. That doesn't mean there shouldn't be one or couldn't be one, but that it's somewhat extraordinary, as in everyone else has figured out a way to get here. So if the district attorney's office says we're not interested in virtual, they're probably not going to get pushback from me, but it may mean they need to wait a little bit longer. Number two, my review of the medical information, I don't think I'm disclosing anything I shouldn't, because I think it's in a filing, is that the medical professional said that Mr. Giuliani is not cleared for air travel, AIR. John Madden drove all over the country in his big bus from stadium to stadium. So one thing we need to explore is whether Mr. Giuliani could get here without jeopardizing his recovery and his health on a train or on a bus or Uber, whatever it would be. The focus seems to have been he's got to be on a plane. And New York is not close to Atlanta, but it's not traveling from Fairbanks. So I think that needs to be part of what we discussed today. And I don't expect you, Mr. Thomas, to pick up your phone and say, great, that'll work. But I think what will flow from today may well be a direction, find out when we might be able to arrange alternate means of transportation. Because the last thing I'll observe is that this is not the first discussion that I've had to have with the district attorney's office and lawyer or lawyers for someone who has been called to appear before the special purpose grand jury. And an issue that often comes up is, well, what's the rush? You've got all these witnesses. Why can't my guy or gal just be a month or two down the road? And I've been educated, having had a chance to speak with the grand jurors a little bit in my supervisory role and then with the various lawyers, that there is a value to sequencing things in a certain way. And so today's date made sense for purposes of what the grand jury is looking at and what the district attorney's office is looking at. Today's not the day. I've already made that decision, but I'll be looking at how close to today we can make it. And it may be Mr. Wade in a moment says, you know what, the middle of September is fine. And then be a quick hearing. And we may clear up a few of the things you want to clear up. But I just wanted to get that out there so you knew where I was coming from and to shape a little bit of what we may hear from the district attorney's office. Mr. Wade, who will be speaking for your team?
Judge, it will be, I will do it.
All right.
Also, Mr. Wooten may chime in from time to time. From our perspective, Judge, at the outset, Mr. Giuliani had counsel in New York who had communication with our office.
And just so we're making the record complete, where is this? This would be Mr. Costello?
Yes, sir.
Okay, because I want to make sure there's not a third person. I know Mr. Thomas professionally, but I also know he's been involved with this case on behalf of Mr. Giuliani here in Georgia. So when you're referring to the other attorney, that's Robert J. Costello.
It is, Judge.
Okay.
So our communications with Mr. Costello largely centered around this Zoom concept, wherein we shared with Mr. Costello that there was no interest in going through the channels to facilitate a Zoom conversation. Not interested in it. The second point of interest with Mr. Costello became then, how about a informal sort of voluntary interview process, which again, we shared with Mr. Costello, no interest there. We need him to be here in front of the grand jury.
And I think Mr. Thomas used the word informal first, and so you may have been just playing off of that, but I'm not sure what the difference would be between an informal and a formal. Was Mr. Costello and are you, Mr. Thomas, offering up, look, Mr. Giuliani would meet, it sounds like would be in the New York area, the prosecutors would travel up there, but it would be a face-to-face with Mr. Giuliani, your team, presumably Mr. Costello and or Mr. Thomas as well. I don't know what makes it formal or informal, but I want to make sure that the hangup wasn't, we don't want it informal, we want it formal. What I'm hearing you say is the format in which we want to interact with Rudy Giuliani is he is testifying to the grand jury.
That's the format that we would like to interact with Mr. Giuliani, but the offer from Mr. Costello was, let's have a conversation not in front of the grand jury, just sort of an informal conversation. So the distinction there is in front of the grand jury and not.
Okay.
To which we replied, not interested in that. Mr. Giuliani has been ordered to appear. Then the conversation shifted to, well, from Mr. Costello's standpoint, we could get the order changed. Well, I then explained to Mr. Costello, there's a problem with that. We don't change orders. Judges do that. So we're going to abide by the court's order. At which point the communication sort of broke down from there.
When did Mr. Thomas appear on your radar as being a point of contact for Mr. Giuliani?
Mr. Thomas reached out to my cell phone on this past Friday evening. I spoke with him for probably less than a minute, indicated that I was in a meeting and that I would reach back out to him after the meeting had adjourned. The meeting didn't adjourn until late Friday evening, so I did not reach back out to Mr. Thomas. Subsequently, we received notice of the filing for continuance.
Let me pause you for 1 second. Mr. Thomas, just so I can build the timeline. Do you agree that your first attempt to contact, it may have been when you were brought on board, but your first attempt to contact the district attorney's office would have been just this past Friday?
That's accurate.
Okay, thank you.
So there was no attempt to reach back out to Mr. Thomas because the district attorney's office received notice of the filing. We then started to prepare a response, and here we are.
So had Mr. Costello communicated to you, or it looks like some of the email traffic was with Mr. Wooten, anything about, well, if we can't work out a Zoom or a formal or informal interview in New York, my client's not coming down because of these medical issues? Or was the first you heard about that, I don't mean in the media, you read that he had to work through some medical issues, but the first you heard about it through counsel would have been when Mr. Thomas either spoke to you on the phone or filed what he filed on behalf of his client?
No, sir. So during the course of the conversation with Mr. Costello, after there was no meeting of the minds in terms of the form of testimony, Mr. Costello then offered up that, well, my client, Mr. Giuliani, is unable to to travel, is what he said. He's
Okay.
unable to travel. We then started to investigate Mr. Giuliani's claim of being unable to travel and uncovered the things that the court has read in our filings. He did share with us the medical note from the doctor, I believe it was Dr. Eric Nearbit. What concerned the state judge candidly is that this is an infectious disease doctor. The claims that Mr. Giuliani was asserting had everything to do with heart. There's a conflict. So at that point, the state delved into sort of an investigative mode to figure out if Mr. Giuliani had in fact taken part in any travel. And we were able to unfold or understand that at least there was some tickets purchased to travel out of the country by Mr. Giuliani. It greatly concerned the state. So we started to resist any, any offers of Mr. Giuliani not being able to travel when we could see that he was clearly doing it.
Okay, and it sounds like it may be less clear than that, and Mr. Thomas will address at least maybe the overseas airfare purchases. But you pointed to some additional evidence that showed at a minimum, Mr. Giuliani was finding it doable to get out of New York to, doesn't matter where he's going, he got out of New York.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So we're clear on the record, the doctor's last name is Neibart. Neibart is how I'd say it, but we're talking about the same doctor. Okay. So what is ultimately then the district attorney's request? I'm not at this point saying Mr. Giuliani is in contempt of anything. I excused his presence today. We need to see what ultimately the next directive is going to be, because I can modify orders. I want it to be realistic and feasible, but also something that is somewhat aligned with the way the investigation work that you and the grand jury are undertaking is unfolding.
Yes, sir. Bearing in mind, Judge, that the conversation that we had with Mr. Costello was over a 2.5-week period or so, maybe 3-week period. At no point during the course of those conversations did he indicate that he would be filing a motion for continuance. Our point of contention is that could have been done then. And had he done it then, we could have engineered a date by this point, as opposed to having to do it the eve of his testimony. In terms of our availability, the court asked a direct question. We prefer that because he could not be here today to testify, that he shows up either on August 11th, August 17th.
So the 11th is this Thursday, and the 17th is next Wednesday.
Yes, sir.
Okay, and those are dates based on your firsthand knowledge of when witnesses are coming in and the grand jury's availability, that Mr. Giuliani wouldn't be sitting around waiting for a 5-minute appearance at the end of the day.
Yes, sir.
Okay, got it. All right. Mr. Thomas, anything you want to say in response to that, feel free to say it. And then what I really like to get into is the doability, the practicality of either the 11th or probably more likely the 17th for an in-person appearance where we sort out something short of air travel. Again, because I'm relying on what I know you received from Mr. Costello, and that's Dr. Neibart saying air travel. It's twice, and it was air travel. And sure, there are a million reasons why getting on an airplane and pressurization and depressurization may not make good health sense, but you don't run into those on the Acela or whatever it might be.
Sure. I would like to just clarify a couple of things before I speak to those issues, Judge. I have just a couple of exhibits, just because I want the record to be clear. This is a copy of Mr. Giuliani's passport. The last date that he is of international travel was October 18th, 2021.
Okay.
So let me be clear, he's not flying around anywhere internationally.
But before that goes much further, did you redact any? Good. I just want to make sure because you know where this is going to end up, and that's on you. Yes, please. Thank you.
Secondly, and I'd ask just that be marked for the purposes of this hearing as just not a witness one, perhaps would be the appropriate designation.
Witness one it is.
And secondly, witness two is an email from a Mr. or Ms., I don't know, Hashimi. It's dated July 10th, 2022. And I think if the court and counsel will read that, again, it just makes clear that nobody here is, Mr. Giuliani is not traveling around the country. These reservations, and I won't rehash what's in the motion, these reservations were made prior to the procedure happening.
This is for the conference overseas.
And there actually were several kind of events that were lumped into that. But yes, this is for the overseas travel. I don't think we put in our motion because I didn't know at the time the procedure was on or about July 4th. And for the record, I've been at least authorized to disclose this. He had 2 coronary heart stents, I guess implanted.
That's what they do with them.
Yeah. I can't speak to Mr. Wade's concern about the doctor because, again, the DA's office wouldn't communicate with me, but I will note that the doctor's information was provided. He could have been contacted to say, you're not really a heart doctor. You know, how do you know these things? That didn't happen. But I think that this email makes clear, and I will just read a portion of it. And this is dated July 10th, 2022. I had a good conversation with the mayor yesterday. She was happy to hear that the mayor is recovering, but asked me to write to you. Everyone here is eager to see him, but his health is more important. An arrangement could be made for the trip a few weeks later, late August or September, because of the long trip that he must take. I think that this document, certainly to the extent there's any merit, any credibility at all in the claims that the district attorney's office has made with respect to his inability to travel by air, I think this addresses that. With respect to your question about the feasibility of August 11th or August 17th, Judge, what I would submit is that we're in the same place on August 11th or August 17th as we are today. Now, obviously, if the court makes an order, we're going to do our best to comply with that order. But Mr. Giuliani is a 78-year-old man. He has to travel when in the airports by wheelchairs. There's some knee issues that I'm not fully briefed on. But we're in the same position on August 11th or August 17th. I have not, let me say this. Again, if the court orders that he travel by Greyhound to Atlanta, we're going to do what the court orders him to do. I think that's impractical for any number of reasons. It is not a 4-hour trip to New Hampshire where he's traveling by private car. It's just different. In particular, given that he has these health concerns. Now, I understand that the doctor didn't say he could not travel by Greyhound for 17 hours or 20 hours. I think that's just impractical. And I would just ask the court to, if the DA's office is not willing to discuss, and at least when I sit here and listen today, it sounds like they were willing to discuss, or at least have some discussions, but somehow, and again, never in my experience as a prosecutor or a defense attorney, did the filing of a motion stop negotiations for some accommodation? It's never happened. In fact, I think I sent a letter to them that said, please, let's continue to discuss this. You can report to the court that we've resolved the issue. That didn't happen.
Well, it also, this isn't necessarily your fault. I don't know when you got brought in, but I'm just mindful of the timeline. If you were only able to plug in starting on Friday, that compresses things. It doesn't mean there couldn't have been back and forth. It just, to Mr. Wade's point, there have been work with Mr. Costello, it sounds like, for any number of weeks.
Let me clear that up. I was brought in because there was no movement, right? It wasn't, that Mr. Giuliani had Bill Thomas's cell phone and said, call that Bill Thomas guy in Atlanta. That's not what happened. It was that we just want to get this thing moved. And to the Mr. Wade's comment that they could have filed a motion to continue a long time ago, we didn't want to do that. We wanted to work it out. Yes, that could have absolutely have been done. But Mr. Costello tried to work out a reasonable accommodation. I contacted Mr. Wade, waited on that phone call. That didn't happen. And again, we're just here today going, we just want a reasonable accommodation so the 78-year-old man who has health conditions can get here and give them or satisfy the directives from a New York court and from this court. That's what we're asking for, Judge.
Okay, I appreciate that. Not an unreasonable request, but we'll need to figure out how best to accommodate the concerns. Mr. Wade.
If I might just for clarification purposes, the initial contact with Mr. Costello was that Mr. Giuliani was unable to travel at all. That was the initial contact. That was the initial correspondence that it sent over to us. It was immediately afterwards when we said to Mr. Costello, well, we have information to the contrary. He's been traveling. He then follows up with a different note that says no air travel,
okay,
which is quite different, which is what caused the communication to stall because we couldn't reach an agreement. But to be clear, it's not that we weren't communicating back and forth with the other side, Judge. It was just that we weren't agreed.
Okay. So here's what I propose, and then I invite feedback from both sides while we're together. I propose we shift Mr. Giuliani's appearance date to August 17th. He'll need to be here in person. That gives him a week and a day to sort out whether he would travel by private coach or bus or whatever it would be. And it's over different segments. Maybe he goes down to Washington as the first part and reconnects with people there and then travels another few hours. I don't mean to prescribe it, but I'm picking that later date because I certainly want to give Mr. Giuliani, his legal team, and the medical professionals an opportunity to weigh in on this. I am not all-knowing about his health condition, and it may well be that Dr. Nybart is willing to provide something with a bit more detail, more than one line, explaining, and if it needs to be under seal, Mr. Thomas, easy to have it be under seal, explaining why a gradual journey south from New York to here, arriving in time to appear on the 17th, is inconsistent with his healthcare situation. And if a doctor says it's inconsistent with his healthcare situation, we're going to change the date. This is important, but it's not that important. And I know that you have other witnesses you can be talking to. But the way this is played out, I think it's important to set a date. And what I'll ask Mr. Thomas is that as you work with Mr. Costello and other folks on the Giuliani support team, that if you're going to seek to bump the 17th till later, that happens sooner. In other words, not on the 15th. But that's going to require some conversations. And it may well be that the doctors say, oh, that's something you could do. It's like driving to New Hampshire times 3. So just do it in 3 legs. You know, folks in DC, spend the night there and work your way down. He can set his own itinerary. I'm confident he could figure out a way short of Greyhound that will get him to Atlanta. That's not an airplane. And certainly the district attorney's office would be involved in defraying some of the expenses. If it's a gold-plated limo, it may be that there's a cap that the state can afford. But of course, Mr. Giuliani would be coming down here at the state's behest, court order, but there need to be discussions about that. Most of all, it's the health concerns. And so if there is documentation from a medical professional that that's just not the right plan for your client, then we'll pick a different date. The very limited information I have from a doctor from a very fancy hospital is that air travel is not compatible with Mr. Giuliani's condition right now. And so that's why I'm saying don't do it by air. And that's plenty of time to make the trip, 13-hour drive. So, Mr. Thomas, that's my proposal. I will put it in writing just so it's anchored. And I know you will confer with Mr. Costello and others, and just if it's not doable, the sooner you can let Mr. Wade and me, we can do this via email initially, and then you'll need to file something eventually, the better, because then the district attorney's office can substitute others on the 17th for your client. But let's make that our stretch goal. Any questions beyond the natural concern of, I don't know if my client's health condition will allow that, but I'm letting you explore that and have a chance to respond.
I think I understand the court's order. I do have an ancillary request, and the court may say deal with that somewhere else or not. We have, in several communications to Mr. Wade, I have made the inquiry of whether or not Mr. Giuliani is a target of this investigation.
Right.
I know that we could probably have some other hearing about privileges and things like that. I understand that's not what we're here for today. That inquiry that I have not yet received a response to will dictate certainly how counsel addresses this matter with my client. It will dictate how things go here if we make the 17th. So that's my inquiry on the record. If they don't want to, I'll just make that inquiry on the record and leave it at that.
I suspected that will come up today. Fair inquiry. I'm not going to require the state to respond in this setting, but I would implore, it's not in order, that the state at least address that with counsel for Mr. Giuliani before he gets here. Let's assume for a minute the 17th works out. You can't get a doctor's note for that. And so he'll be here. You know full well, Mr. Wade, from other witnesses we've dealt with, depending on your answer to that question, the time in front of the grand jury gets smaller or larger. There are fewer things you can ask. There are fewer things that get said, et cetera. And I think it would help Mr. Giuliani's legal team be more prepared for the inevitable discussion that you and Mr. Wooten, Mr. Wakeford, Mr. Thomas, and I will have about whatever designation your office applies to Mr. Giuliani, what impact that has on the extent of his time in front of the grand jury. So this isn't the time to do it, as Mr. Thomas noted. I think it's important that he did flag that again. I saw it in some of the correspondence. And so just address it as you will, just know, and you've now bumped into this, if it's something that you tell Mr. Thomas on the 17th, as Mr. Giuliani's about to walk in that grand jury room, you know what's going to happen. There'll be a big timeout and we'll have to have a meeting in there, et cetera. So I'm confident you'll manage it. One of you will, but don't leave them hanging on that front.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Anything else, Mr. Thomas?
No, Your Honor. Okay.
Mr. Wade, the 17th is the current game plan. You will get the same information I get from Mr. Thomas and or Mr. Costello. And again, Mr. Thomas, if there are things that need to be shared under seal because of the health information, not a problem. They'll stay under seal. But let's plan for now on the 17th and just keep the channels of communication open.
Yes, sir.
Anything else from your office?
Just nothing involving this issue, but there's a small matter that I'd like to speak with the court outside of
this room. Okay. All right. Mr. Thomas, thank you for making yourself available on short notice.
Thank you, Judge.
Mr. Wade, as always, thanks to you and your team for being here. that's it for this. Oh, I have W1. W2, you kind of read from a little bit, and then I never got W2. So if you want me to make it part of the record that Ms. Rivers is making, I'm happy to do that. Thank you. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Judge.